good afternoon, Fintan.
Good afternoon,
I'm
Deirdre.
Professor Deirdre Heenan from Ulster University, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Fintan O'Toole, who's known to all of you as a journalist, broadcaster, and award-winning author. I do have your book sitting beside me as a useful prop. Fintan and I spoke in Derry 2 years ago about Brexit, but much has changed. In fact, the world has changed in a way that we couldn't have thought about. So Fintan's going to give us some thoughts on Ireland in a post-Brexit world and the lessons from COVID-19 for about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then we will have a more informal discussion about the implications of both for all Ireland and the world globally. So over to you, Fintan.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot to Garrett and the festival for the invitation. Really sorry I can't be with everybody in person, but hopefully next year in Derry. And we will get back to, I think, what's irreplaceable, which is that sense of direct contact. But it's lovely in the meantime to be able to talk to you, Deirdre, and to talk to everybody else in a virtual way, at least. An interesting place to start, I thought, might be actually just to go back to early January, the first week in January, which now seems like it could be 20 years away, when Boris Johnson first mentioned the coronavirus. So his first public mention of the word was in a big speech in Greenwich, where he was celebrating the fact that Britain had now left the European Union, and talking up the great opportunity for the new golden age, right, which was undoubtedly going to come. And it was striking actually that he was speaking under these great paintings in the Great Maritime Hall in Greenwich of celebrating King William III and celebrating, as Johnson said, the Union, the great moment of the creation of the Union. And he slipped into this reference to coronavirus. So he was talking about how this great new age of British mercantile power was going to arise. And we should be wary of people who are warning us about this coronavirus thing which is coming. Don't let them interfere with, with our great hopes, and people talking about protection and all this kind of stuff. This is freebooting, mercantilism coming back, and all this stuff about, people wanting to protect themselves is just nonsense, and we're not to listen to it. That was his first reference, in fact, to the coronavirus crisis. So it was interesting that at that moment there was some kind of intertwining, in a way, of these two crises that face all of us in both parts of Ireland, and of course in the wider archipelago. It might be just worth saying that there are a few ways in which the coronavirus crisis has itself, if not altered the landscape, it's certainly highlighted some of the ways in which the landscape is already changing, the political landscape. So there's three really big things, I suppose, that have come out of the coronavirus crisis and the way it's being dealt with. One of these is actually not very noticeable because it's about what didn't happen. But if you're in the south of Ireland and you're thinking about this, it's really quite remarkable. And it's simply this: at almost any other period over the last almost 100 years since the foundation of the Irish state, if the Dublin government was faced with an international crisis, who would it look to in the first instance for guidance? London. It would look to, and quite reasonably in one way, right? You'd say, well, okay, we're a small country. We have some expertise, but a limited amount of expertise. The British government has this enormous apparatus of science and of experience and of global power. In the first instance, you would imagine the sort of senior civil servants in Dublin on the phone to their counterparts in Whitehall saying, what are you doing about this? How are you handling this? What do you think is the best way to go here? What's very striking, of course, is that that didn't happen. So it wasn't in anybody's head to say, "Oh, look, London is the place to look here for guidance and expertise, right? and reassurance." That's putting it very, very mildly, right? Dublin was looking in very different directions, right? The European Centre for Disease Control, the World Health Organization. So that itself, in terms of what didn't happen, was telling us about a really pretty fundamental shift in attitudes in governmental circles, and I mean that in the broadest sense in the South, beginning the process of thinking about Ireland as a European country and as a member of the international community, and only thereafter as a part of the Atlantic archipelago, or whatever else we want to call it. The second thing that's been very, very striking has been, of course, the way in which the coronavirus crisis has played out somewhat differently in each of the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. Again, this would have been unthinkable, maybe not 10 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago. You could not have imagined sort of a single crisis, a single wave of problem washing over the UK and the constituent parts dealing with it in different ways. Obviously, this has been most striking in relation to Scotland. The Scottish government having a different kind of voice, a different kind of presence, often very different advice to the one in London. But you see it in Wales, and of course in the usual complicated ways you see it in Belfast too. With the very complex dance that we've seen between Sinn Féin and the DUP as to whether the lead should be taken from London or Dublin. But nevertheless, that cocktail producing a different kind of response. Subtly different. We're not saying that these are kind of huge radical shifts, but they're very noticeable, right? And again, this is stuff that we wouldn't have expected 20 years ago, and it's pointing to something again, right? So just as the first thing is pointing towards the way in which Dublin, broadly speaking, is thinking in much more international and European terms, the second one is showing us how the constituent parts of the United Kingdom are becoming more independent. I don't even think about that in terms of sovereignty, but just in terms of the way they operate, but also in terms of the way their populations think. So people in Scotland were looking to Edinburgh for who's the authority, who's in charge here, who's the daddy and mommy, oh, it's Nicola, that's fine, and equally strikingly in Wales, there was a Welsh discourse about coronavirus. So this is showing us how devolution and the strains on the union are kind of playing out. And the third big thing that this thing has shown us is that, frankly, the power of the British state, that idea which has dominated the context for all discussions about the Union or United Ireland or everything else, which is the power of the British state. Well, you start looking at it and saying, well, what power? Where is this power? It is absolutely tragic, and I don't think anybody can or should take any pleasure in it at all. But it's a reality that England, left to its own devices in relation to this crisis, has proven to have a remarkably inept response. And that's not a political statement. It's a statement of fact, right? It's a statement which is borne out in the figures that we've seen, which show that the highest excess mortality in Europe has been in England. And we know the reasons for that, where we know the inability to act in a timely manner, to make decisions and follow through on them, the pursuit of fantasies like herd immunity, the bizarre English exceptionalism of looking for, just take very briefly two examples of that. One was about the need for ventilators in hospitals. No, we're not going to just buy ventilators or license existing ventilators. We're going to have like a space program in England to invent new English ventilators. a completely insane, time-wasting, money-wasting project, which produced not a single new design, right? They ended up doing what any sensible person would have done, which is just go with what you already have and just get more of them into hospitals. The second one would be the app, the tracing app. We can't do the same tracing app as everybody else in the developed world is doing. Oh God, no! We have to have our special red, white, blue app, which is going to be developed in the Isle of Wight, and that, of course, then turns out also to be a disaster and to go nowhere and to have to be abandoned. And these are just examples of the way in which same kind of mentality that you have in Brexit, this exceptionalism, this English nationalism, feeding into the coronavirus response with absolutely tragic consequences. I mean, Neil Ferguson, who's regarded as the great expert on the statistical epidemiology in England, has said that at least 20,000 people died unnecessarily because of these decisions. I mean, this is historically unthinkable. The pursuit of these fantasies is literally murderous. So these three things are telling us that, and this is what huge crises do. They don't necessarily transform anything. They expose all the weaknesses that are already there, or all of the ways in which society and politics are already changing. So these things then they would be huge in themselves, right? If this was all that was going on, you would say, okay, these are seismic shifts. But of course, it's very easy for us, and a great relief in some ways for all of us to stop thinking about Brexit and to forget. I heard somebody on radio this morning in Dublin expressing shock. They'd heard somebody mention Brexit on a news item. Oh God, that's still going on. It's not done.
I remember that.
And it's not done. And indeed, it's coming down the tracks very, very rapidly. So you've written brilliantly about this, and you're more aware of it in some ways than I am. But what we're looking at, is a situation in which, if you were to bet on rational or irrational outcomes, the clever bookie, would always put the odds on the irrational ones, for a good reason, right? Which is that's been the story of Brexit, right? So if you take this narrative, where has it started and where has it ended up? Well, it hasn't quite ended up, but where are we now? Remember that it starts with overwhelming statements from the Brexiteers themselves that Britain will have an incredibly close relationship after Brexit with the European Union economically. They'll be very close at all sorts of political levels, and cooperation and all that sort of stuff is going to be going on. More or less telling people you're not going to really notice any great difference here, except that we will be theoretically sovereign and that'll make us feel good. And of course, Boris Johnson said no sane person would ever think of leaving the single market. And the dynamic of it all the way through has been, once they got the vote passed in 2016, has been towards the extremes. Remember that you now have a British cabinet, each of whom had to sign up to a loyalty declaration that they would support a no-deal Brexit in order to be allowed into the cabinet. Right? So it's become self-selective, it's become self-reinforcing, and even though at a rational level you said, look, there has to be a deal. I mean, it's so insane to think about there being no deal. Irrationality has always trumped that rationality so far. So as well as the things that the coronavirus has shown us, we're also facing the strong possibility of either no deal at all, which would have huge implications, of course, for Northern Ireland. And is a real possibility if you look at the lack of preparation, right? So why is there no preparation for how the Northern Ireland Protocol is going to be implemented? And that's only one example. Every single aspect of the realities of this, there seems to have been, almost no real engagement with the reality of what this might mean, which does suggest that a no deal is in their heads. Or I think more likely an extremely minimal no tariff sort of deal, which doesn't address any of the larger issues, the economic issues, trade issues around rules of origin, around standards, around how you do services, but also doesn't really address the political questions about where the hell Britain is. So all of these things are pointing us in a direction of radical instability. The whatever is over, that great phrase that won Boris Johnson an election, it's not the implications of the stuff that you and I were talking about a couple of years ago, the rise of English nationalism for Ireland and for the architecture of relationships on these two islands.
Yeah. There's so much in there, Fintan, I don't know where to start. But I mean, to go back to your 3 points, which I suppose to start by saying we are in incredible times. We didn't think that Brexit would be knocked off the agenda by this COVID-19, and the response to it by the British government has frankly been appalling. And not just the response, but as you talk about throughout the Brexit negotiations, the constant denial, delusions, the ideas of exceptionalism, that we would do it differently. And I'm just wondering, on your first point, when you talked about Dublin and that automatic reaction of looking towards London and saying, well, what should we do here? How do we take advice from you? What are you thinking of doing? Now, remembering that we were in a process where we had no government, essentially. We had a caretaker government. The Taoiseach had a pretty appalling time at the polls. But in coronavirus, he seemed to come into his own. Perhaps it was because of his medical training, but he made some very important speeches. But there seemed to be almost a newfound confidence in the leadership of Ireland, in the people who were making decisions. And yes, they bypassed London and they went to Europe. And do you think that's because there is now a mindset that says we are part of a much bigger piece here? We're not this small island off the UK. We are actually, in our own right, a strong political entity. And I'm sure you've read the article in the Financial Times that talks about the political strength of Ireland and how this came about. And I think they're almost amazed and trying to work out how Ireland found itself in the centre of the world stage.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm not used to finding myself in the position of praising Irish governments. It's not my job. But the confidence. So Brexit itself has been a huge part of this, right? So first of all, of course, the realization that Britain and particularly England is in real trouble here, and has been taken over by all the things that you were articulating. The delusional mentality, the exceptionalism, the inability to match statements and language to fact. This is complete divorce between what you say and what's real. I think that was a terrible shock for Irish governments. I mean, remember, they were very used to dealing on a very friendly basis with Whitehall, not just politicians but civil servants. Like they've been working together on obviously on the peace process for so long, but also of course working together in Europe. They're very close allies in the European Union, and we're very used to this relationship and quite cozy in it. And so I think they were shocked out of any complacency about that by the way Brexit has unfolded. But secondly, I think the second part of your point is also really true. Which is that the confidence then came from the fact that, oh God, we're in a real crisis here, and the crisis, the existential crisis, came down to the border issue. Of course, here's something we just cannot have. Cannot allow this to happen. If it happens, it's catastrophic for our island. And so we have to stop it. How do we stop it? Well, the only way to stop this is by really upping your game diplomatically. By working in an extraordinarily coherent way, primarily within the European Union. Making the Irish border issue a European issue, not an Irish issue. But also, if you look at the way they worked with those American politicians who are still on the sane spectrum, principally Democrats, of course, but the way of internationalizing that issue, making it one in which Ireland was not isolated, and holding their nerve through it as well. I mean, there was huge pressure coming from London,
Yeah.
To say, look, don't bother your pretty little green heads about this. It'll be all right. You're just making a fuss. Trust us, we'll sort all this out. And not giving into that was very important, I think, in terms of enhancing that confidence. And I think that definitely did then play into the coronavirus crisis response, which is by no means perfect, by the way. Wouldn't for a moment say that the Irish government got everything right. I think made terrible mistakes in relation to nursing homes and residential institutions in particular. But in comparison to, if you look either west or east, if you look to America or Britain, were the two countries that Ireland would be used to looking to for a start. I mean, Ireland does look like paradise. Politicians behaved benignly and responsibly. Even if people were making mistakes, you felt they were making mistakes, for good reasons. They weren't being malign about this, or they weren't pursuing, crazy hairs all over the place. They were trying to do their best, and it was a population that could at least trust that in its government. At least think, actually, however much we like them or don't like them in this crisis, they're on our side. That's an incredibly important test of a democracy, and I think broadly speaking, it's true that Irish democracy pretty much passed that test.
Yeah, I think it did. I think there was trust, and the public have an understanding that we are in unprecedented times and there are challenges, but I think they felt they were getting the truth, and what was being told to them was where we were at the time, and the difficulties weren't really sugar-coated. But to go back to a previous point, and I suppose the point that I've always been interested in, is the devolved settlement. And is it that COVID-19 perhaps has cemented further the importance of the devolution settlement in the UK, and actually then really started to raise questions about the future of the Union? I know we talked about this in terms of Brexit, but just as you said, in Scotland, for example, people really looked to Edinburgh for their answers. Nicola Sturgeon was there. She was there on a daily basis, responding to Scottish issues, as was Mark Drakeford. Came into his own in Wales, I think, and played a very strong role in reassuring the Welsh public as to what was going on and the action that had been taken. Northern Ireland is always going to be slightly different, but it was interesting that the politics eventually took second order to the public health issues, and they looked to the south, they looked east, but they began to say, we've got to have a bespoke answer for what's going on here in Northern Ireland, recognising that we have a dispersed population and the issues were slightly different. And I think they were getting to the stage, maybe after a rocky start, of saying, we're in a position now to take the best of both worlds, as were, and look at what the World Health Organization is saying, look at what the Chief Scientific Officer is saying, but in the end, try to do what's best for this population. And I don't think I could have imagined a Prime Minister addressing the nation and having to repeatedly remind himself that he was speaking to England. He was not speaking for the UK. And that in itself, I thought, was extraordinary and something that didn't really get an awful lot of coverage in the media. And people would then on Twitter or in the papers talk about the UK or Britain. And inevitably, people from the devolved regions came back and said, actually, you're not speaking about us. We've got our own government. So I think in a way, what has happened in terms of COVID has really strengthened and cemented the view that devolution is good and we should try to make it work, because yes, we're in the UK, but we're all very different and facing different issues, and the solutions will be different.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating the way you put it, and certainly from my perspective, what I've been watching, all of that absolutely holds true. And it is very profound, because historically you would expect in an existential crisis, right, where huge numbers of lives are at stake, that tends to be where the old habits kind of kick back in.
Yeah.
People, you rally around the flag, the existing flag.
You almost go to the comfort blanket, don't you?
Yeah,
makes you feel safe. Yeah.
And it's very interesting. So, and of course that actually happens, right? So if you look at the polls in Britain, certainly, the initial polls, you did have a big rallying around Boris Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to remember it now, but of course, the same thing happened with Donald Trump. So, but that people, because people desperately want to believe that whoever is in charge, and it's almost like, I don't care who's in charge, I just want them to keep me safe. I want to believe in them. I want to know they're telling me the truth. I want to know that they have a really good grasp of what's going on. I want to know that they're listening to the best advice and processing it. And I want to know that they're able to give me reassurance that isn't just sort of bland reassurance, but actually based on some reality. So that all happened in England. And I think more broadly in the UK in the initial stages of the crisis, but it dissipated very fast.
Yeah.
And I think this is, I think for all the reasons you're saying, is absolutely fascinating historical development. People started looking for reassurance to their own devolved entities. And some of this was accidental, right? In the sense that, leave aside any political preferences or ideology. Would you prefer to buy a used car from Nicola Sturgeon or from Boris Johnson? Like a simple kind of the personality question is important, and it because Johnson is such an extreme, as a bluffer, as a person who has built a career on mendacity, on lying, basically. He was always going to get into this sort of stage where, people's ability to believe anything that he was saying was going to be very, very strained. So that was the accidental side of it. But then I think, exactly as you were saying, it showed us, that if it could bear the weight of the crisis, of this coronavirus crisis, it showed us that the devolved settlements have actually become very robust. Even, as you say, in Northern Ireland. So you would say the least robust of them, the one that's had so for obvious reasons, so much difficulty in sustaining itself, under the pressure of the crisis, actually turned out to be able to function.
Yeah.
And as you said, I'd be very interested to hear how you think this is going to play out in Northern Ireland. But I mean, do you think it's going to have longer term consequences in terms of the way people think about Stormont and think about the devolved settlement, that under this pressure, it was capable of producing some kind of functioning consensus?
I think it will. I think we have to remember that they were really just back in office when they were faced with this. So they hadn't really even got time to get used to their new office furniture. Then suddenly they're faced with a global health emergency. It's hardly ideal for a new government. But I think most people, if they were trying to be fair, would say they performed well under the circumstances, and moved away from political rhetoric to start talking, for the first time I ever heard, talking about the evidence. Let's follow the evidence. Let's do what's best. Let's learn from other countries. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the usual suspects. We can look at other countries and see what they're doing. And it seemed to me a much more mature approach to politics. I do think the longer term issue will be people started to be much more comfortable here talking about an all-island approach. Now, it depends how you said it, whether it was a shared island, and we know here language is important. But in the end, what people were beginning to say is, we share a landmass. Whatever you think about that, that is a fact. And surely we should be mature enough to say that in sharing this landmass, we must be able to find the benefits of this, harness the benefits of being this island, make it work for everyone, and then let's set the politics aside almost, which is unthinkable in a way for us to be having those type of conversations. And I do think now we're beginning tentatively to start talking about, well, what are the implications here for cross-border health? In the end, we're still a small island. Is it really sensible that we have separate learning systems, that we have separate professional systems? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't we have better outcomes if we shared some of our resources and our knowledge? And we did it in a way around the Children's Heart Unit, and we have shared cancer services. But I think this has opened a much broader conversation around, if we could share our knowledge in terms of animal health, and did it in the face of the foot and mouth crisis, where Ian Paisley was talked about the Catholic and Protestant cows. Surely it was only a matter of time before something came along that made us say, healthcare is something we all value. Why is it that we are operating in these separate silos? And couldn't we do something to try and harness the benefits of being an island economy? So I think that's the long-term implication in terms of health. I mean, I don't ever imagine that we're going to start saying, well, there's a vaccination in the south, but we in the north can't have it. We're going to have to wait until London produces something. Those days are over. And I think what we have witnessed in the Northern Ireland is a growing political maturity to say, ideologically, you can have your own ideology and your own identity, but it doesn't change the reality of the geography and where we sit and who we share this island with. I don't know if you've witnessed much of that conversation around healthcare, and you did mention care homes, and care homes here were a particularly damning indictment of lack of preparation, inability to see who the vulnerable populations were, and that happened north and south of this island. And I would like to think that when we are reflecting on what happened and how we ensure that it doesn't happen again, we won't just look to what happened here, but we will also look to what happened in the south and say, did they do something differently, or were they in exactly the same position? What can we collectively learn from this about better healthcare, better outcomes, and better predictions of what is likely to happen?
I couldn't agree more with that, and I really do think we have to have this conversation. And I think it's a broader point in a way, which is that, it's a sort of cart before the horse sort of argument. Let's start talking about what we share and how the island works before we start talking about the political structures. Political structures in any democracy should arise out of what is it you need them to do, and so if we need new political structures, and I think we do, but we really need to start talking about what are the things that those political structures are for. And what they're for is exactly the same north of the border as it is south of the border, as it is or should be in any democracy, right? Which is the public good. And the public good in terms of health has been taken away from all of us. So one of the things the coronavirus has come along to remind us of is that for most of human history, right, public health is vastly more important than private health. Yes, it's a terrible tragedy if you have a heart attack or you have cancer or whatever. It's awful. But the things that most people died from too young throughout most of history, apart from wars, were plagues, illnesses. I'm old enough, to remember on buses in Dublin, there were always kind of notices saying, please do not expectorate, which meant spit. I remember spelling it out. What does that mean, Daddy? Expectorate. But it was public health. It was the sense that actually, if somebody has a disease, you might get that disease off them. Communicable diseases were, part of people's lives. Polio, TB before that, so all of this kind of stuff. And we've sort of allowed ourselves to drift into a mentality of privatizing healthcare, either doing that literally in terms of making it a business, which has gone much further, of course, in the south than it has in the north, or in terms of the images you see of healthcare, which is, which gym are you going to? What's your diet? All of which are very, very good and necessary and important things. But that's what health is about, and not this sort of collective interdependence. So we've had a really shocking reminder of this collective interdependence. And what we should be doing is entering into real conversations now about what works and what doesn't work in health and social care systems. On an island this size, what is it that we can share? How can we help each other out in this? And I think you're absolutely right. I think the crisis in the nursing homes and care homes, almost exactly the same on both sides of the border, and for exactly the same reasons, which are reasons fundamentally to do with social injustice and fundamentally to do with the way in which, you're brilliant and all this, but the way in which so many people, once they reach a certain age, are out of sight and therefore out of mind.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount to learn. And
Yeah.
if it does have to be learned, though, I think this is the interesting point: is that this is not about a takeover by the South of the North. I think it might be about the South and the North, jointly going back to the benefits of the greatest achievement in British civilization, which is the National Health Service,
Yeah.
which we've never had in the South.
And also in terms, I suppose, of social trends, we have the same demographic trends, and we are now facing into an older population, a growing older population, which from my perspective is a great thing. I get kind of worried when people talk about the tsunami of aging, because my view is I'd like to live as long as possible. Thank you very much. But I do think that our governments haven't really given it enough thought. And when you look at what we used to call in the countryside the hen housing of older people, is this really what we want? How can we not have a system where we're ensuring that we know from our own research that people want to age in place? They want to stay at home as long as possible. And whilst we say that that's our objective, we don't seem to be able, on either side of the border, to have a system where we have domiciliary care, where we really thought through social care. And the other thing I thought that came through the response from both was the implicit aging, the implicit ageism that is rife in our society. Because I think if this pandemic had been disproportionately affecting younger people, and you've been turning on the television to hear of children dying on a daily basis, we've been stopping in our tracks. We've been saying, we can't deal with this, we can't compute this. But almost implicitly it was older people with underlying conditions, ergo they were going to die anyway. In fact, some people explicitly said it. Some of the language in the media about harvesting older people dropping like flies. I think, again, it has raised social issues as well as political issues that we need to talk about. What do we see as the value of older people? Do we really want to separate them out from our society, or don't we think they have an intrinsic value?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of key question when we're talking about, whatever the post-Brexit settlement is, and this question, about people trying to engage in this, the new Irish government talking about shared space or shared island, and I know the SCLP is launching its initiative, and various people are trying to think about this sort of stuff. But if we are going to talk about that, let's go back to those basics. Let's talk about what kind of social values do we have? What sense of citizenship do we have? Is citizenship just whether your passport is British or Irish, or is it where do you belong? Where do you have a right to belong? Even that idea of shared space, for example, the shared island, shared space, which I've been talking about for years, and goes back to John Hume talking about it, and it's in the Irish Constitution now, effectively, sharing the territory. Sharing space is not just about the island, of course; it's about every one of our communities. And this speaks to your point about older people, for example. If you segregate people off, you were saying you don't share our space. Yeah. And once people don't share your space, then they don't count. They're really not in your eye line. And I think we've had this terrible shock, but also we've been reminded of I don't know how you feel about this, but there's been a lot of very negative talk for 30 years now about the loss of social capital and all that kind of stuff. We're becoming more atomized and we're all things. Actually, in one way, the response to this crisis by ordinary people, has shown us that that's just not true.
Yeah, I agree.
People have been perfectly capable of listening to collective messages, of acting on them, of being really responsible. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but the vast majority of people have actually tried to be careful and responsible, and they've tried to look out for their neighbours, particularly their older neighbours or more vulnerable people. There's been a real sense of solidarity. And there's no point in talking about a 32 county entity or a United Kingdom or whatever union you want to talk about if it's not based on solidarity, if it's not based on a sense that actually we look out for each other in some fundamental way and care about each other. And I suppose that goes back to the question you were raising about, unionists saying, well, you can have your own conversation, and we're not willing to talk to you. Well, okay, if that's about the political architecture, if that conversation isn't the one we can fully have yet, there's lots more stuff we can talk about, and it's the talking and the engagement that's really critical at this stage. I mean, I think as you were saying, we're at a moment when we realize that stuff that we took for granted can't be taken for granted anymore. And that we have to go back to a sense of codependence, interdependence. We depend on each other as much on this island as we do within our own communities. And thinking about how we could make that positive, I think, is the big question.
Yeah, and I suppose we've had a lot of discussion in the media here about the development of the new unit in the Taoiseach's office, and what exactly does that mean, and what will it mean? And of course, some are very dismissive, saying this is just signing off a piece of paper, that there are no plans. There's no vision. We don't know what the timescale is. We don't know, is this going to be senior civil servants, or is it going to be some poor person that's given this as their new job title? And of course, a lot of cynicism. But I do think if we're going to have a conversation which is going to be meaningful, then just as we've been talking about, those conversations need to be around the economy post-Brexit, our healthcare system post-Brexit. What do we want for our children? What do we believe the basics in education that we're aspiring to? But I can understand fully how unionist leaders would still say, no, actually, we don't want to be part of that, because we still believe that in the end, the SDLP, although they put together this commission, and Sinn Féin still share an objective, which is essentially to get rid of us. So why on earth would we be talking about our own demise? And I'm just wondering, how do we develop conversations that change that perception and make it inclusive in a way that is meaningful?
Yeah, I think that is the key question. I think the first thing is to realize that whether you're a unionist or nationalist, and I think we were talking about this before, but this stuff is not our story anymore. So the whole Irish history story over the last 150 years has been about unionism and nationalism on the island and the conflict between them. That's not the big thing that's happening. The big actual thing that's happening is happening on the other island. And it's the rise of English nationalism, the rise of Scottish nationalism, maybe a Welsh identity now actually coming more and more to the fore. We've had consistently now for a couple of months significant majorities in favour of Scottish independence. We have the Scottish Assembly elections coming up, at which the SNP will be seeking a mandate for another referendum. I'm not saying we know where that's going, but what we do know is it's not our story. It's not in our gifts. If Scotland votes for independence, well, it's all very well to say, I'm a unionist, but what are you united to? If, as we're seeing, and you made this very strong point earlier on, if Boris Johnson's having to address the nation as the English nation, this is stuff that just was not on the radar, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. These are big changes, and they're happening whether we like it or not. They're happening, and they're dynamic. And Brexit, remember, is dynamic, right? So if I were a unionist and I were interested in preserving the union and British identity, the first question I'd be asking myself is this may seem ridiculous, but I think it's a key question, right? Is a British identity in Northern Ireland dependent on the union? Or is it something which can be preserved even if the union changes in very radical ways, and even if Northern Ireland changes in very radical ways? I think it has to be. And I think that's absolutely implicit in the Belfast Agreement and in the Irish Constitution. One of the things I think we did talk about this before, but it's just worth briefly going back to it, right? Remember what happened in 98 in the South, which was the change in Articles 2 and 3 in the Constitution. And the new formulation of Irish nationalism, passed by 95% of the electors in the South, is not about territory anymore. It's about uniting in harmony and friendship all the people who share the island in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. Now, that accepts that the diversity of traditions and identities is permanent. It's no longer even theoretically about saying, you're all really Irish and just get with the program, get on board the train. It's actually about saying Irishness itself now is something which can only be expressed in a pluralistic, multiple way, and a big part of that plurality is Britishness. It's a British identity of people in Northern Ireland. I think sincere unionists, have to be thinking about that, and they have to be thinking about what happened to them. I mean, I think it's kind of remarkable that they've sort of buried Boris Johnson's betrayal of the DUP as if it kind of didn't happen. It's an astonishing thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's dynamic, right? So just remember that it's not just a one-off act, right? Because it implicitly separates Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK in an ongoing way. So as the European Union changes, Northern Ireland changes with it, and as the UK, retreats into whatever it's going to retreat into, Northern Ireland separates more and more from it. So Boris Johnson has created a dynamic of instability in terms of Northern Ireland's relationship to the European Union. Irish nationalists didn't do that, right? The Brits did it, London did it, and so if you're a unionist, you really have to start thinking, well, if my identity is dependent on Boris Johnson, I'm screwed, to be quite frank. If my identity is dependent on a conversation in which I have a very strong position, right, as one of the major forces of plurality on the island, then I think that's where the strength of unionism lies.
And also to say, you have the ability to shape it, to have input, to have an understanding of what's being suggested. And there was a kind of debate around the Senate, and whether or not Ian Marshall would get his nomination and would he be there as an Ulster Unionist voice. And I felt in many ways that was missing the point, that could one person ever represent Ulster Unionism in a sense? And if there had to be a voice for Ulster Unionism, shouldn't there be a voice for the non-aligned people? Shouldn't there be a voice for the Northern nationalist? And we get to the stage where we're thinking about what people are actually beginning to think about is representation in the structures of government and what that representation might look like. And should it be 20 seats rather than what we have at the moment? Or should there be a complete deconstruction of what exists, and think again about where are voices heard? How are they heard in a meaningful way? Because we've heard so much about civic forums, and our experience of them very often is talking shops with the usual suspects and really don't achieve very much. And people have become quite cynical about those. But going back to your point, I think around the Irish Sea border and the promises that we would have unfettered access, even everyone looking at it thought, well, that's just impossible. So clearly you're being lied to your face and you must realise it. But I do think there is a beginning of a dawning that English, and particularly English nationalists, have mentally ditched us, have ditched Northern Ireland years ago, and all those opinion polls coming out saying, well, would you prefer Brexit or keep the Union? Well, they were fairly clear in their results that Brexit was the ambition, and in fact, we never really understood those people over there. If we get rid of them, it'll be no big loss. I don't think we should celebrate that. It just simply says that we need to make the best of the plurality that exists here, acknowledge it, try to be generous, and frame that conversation. The difficulty always in the North is once you start to have that conversation, you're accused of being either a Republican or someone with an anti-English, anti-British agenda. But I do think that post-Brexit and after the transition period, we may be able to have those conversations in a more meaningful way, because the realization will be the landscape has changed dramatically and we are not going back. And as much as you want to, I suppose what I would have hoped at this stage is the delusions would have gone and we would be now beginning to accept reality. I see very little sign of that when you read the broadsheets, the English broadsheets. The story hasn't changed at all. It's still going to be fantastic It's going to be world beating. It's going to be world class. And you're thinking, this is absolute delusional nonsense. Now, maybe we might have accepted that in 2017, but we are leaving in a matter of months' time. And businesses here have absolutely no idea what it's going to mean for them. There's no clarity because we're still in the denial phase. But logic would tell you that many small businesses will be worried about their future. People here in Northern Ireland will be worried about the increased costs, which are inevitable, and remembering that we are the poorest region by far. I think we really have to think about how are we going to mitigate what is clearly going to happen. And we can't, almost like we've done before, wait until it happens and then say, oh, we're very poorly prepared for this. So I do think all of those economic and political coming together create a perfect storm for us to have a realistic conversation about the future of this island.
Yeah, I would heartily agree with all that. I think you're absolutely right. It's quite absolutely right. No, there's nothing to celebrate in any of this stuff. Both Brexit and the coronavirus are disastrous. They're absolutely terrible. And anybody who feels any kind of Schadenfreude about tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths in England, really doesn't deserve to be part of this conversation at all. But the fact is that there is no going back. These are either one of these things would have changed the world that we inhabit. The two of them coming together changes the world we inhabit, and in particular the piece of the world that we happen to share in very profound ways. And we don't even understand them all. We've no idea really how Brexit's going to really play out. We've no idea how the coronavirus crisis, which we're still very much in the middle of, is going to play out. But we do know that none of these things, the effects of these things are not going to be short term. Right? So we also know that our economies are destroyed. And then they have this other kind of, just talk about kicking someone when they're down, get all of our economies down on the floor and then come along and thump them with Brexit, it's with maybe a no deal Brexit. It's insane. So we know that we're in crisis mode. We know that what needs to be done is a radical rebuilding. Right? So the option of the status quo just doesn't exist, right? There is no status quo. We're in something else. Mm-hmm. And we either let that unfold in a chaotic way, which is still full of delusion and lies and crazy nationalist exceptionalism, or we accept that these relationships are changing and that we can shape them. We're still human beings. We're still intelligent. We're still creative. We still have the capacity to actually shape these things for our benefit. And thinking about the vast things that we share, like it's not just coronavirus, but like our health systems. But I mean, how the hell are we going to face the climate crisis as two entities on the island? It's idiotic. So from the very practical levels of how businesses are going to function, to the larger geopolitical questions of like, where's Britain in the world right now? It's nowhere. It's a lost place. It's going to be faced probably with losing a Brexit ally in Trump, hopefully in November. It's at war with China. It's at war with Europe. This is profound stuff, and so it's not even necessarily being optimistic. I think it's just being realistic to say that we're going to be forced into conversations about how we rebuild and recreate, and whatever perspective you have, some form of that rebuilding is going to have to be in the frame of an island-wide community. What precise political shape that takes, I think, is a whole other set of questions. But if we don't engage with this, it's not going to go away. Nobody's inventing this stuff. Nobody's saying, let's sit down and talk about a united Ireland because it would be a good idea. Well, some people are, but I think what most people are saying is, look, there's a real, genuine set of changes happening. And we're either the victim of those changes or we can try to shape them collectively in some way.
Yeah, and I think regardless of your political perspective, there is an acknowledgement that the political architecture of this island that has held for over 100 years since the creation of the state is now deeply unstable. and we have a chance to intervene and shape that change, or sit around and wait and let it happen. And I think maybe our conclusion to our talk is that from both our points of view, it's important to get in there and try and shape it and talk and be as generous and open. And there is much that we share. And in terms of outcomes, I think if we focused on what we wanted to see, we would probably come up with a list that would be the same for most people.
Yep. And that's where we should start, isn't it?
It is.